Tonight I would like to introduce Keith Leslie, a member of Socialist Resurgence, an activist, rank and file worker, historian, and the author of the document China, a New Imperialist Power, that is part of the basis of our politics. My name is John Kay. I'll be helping Keith out with the discussion. And without any further ado, I'd like to let Keith have the floor.
All right, everyone, and I'd just like to welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to this talk. So we're going to be discussing China and how it transitioned from a worker state to what's today an imperialist power. So just to start off with, I wanted to give some quick idea of the definitions we're using for these kind of terms, because the definitions that people use vary a lot, and it helps to have everyone sort of on the same page of what everyone's talking about. So when I say that China was a workers' state, what I mean is that it's a state where you had a revolution that eventually led to the overthrow of capitalism, the expropriation of the bourgeoisie, of the capitalist class as a class, the nationalization of property, the establishment of a monopoly on foreign trade, and the use of economic planning to run the economic life of the country. To be sure, from the onset, the Chinese state was controlled by a communist party that retained many of the features of Stalinism and imposed very severe political restrictions on working class life. That's why we refer to it as a deformed workers' state often, that from the onset it had this political control from the bureaucracy, and it was not ruled through workers' democracy, but it still did have this fundamental economic foundation to it. And what that meant is, when it was a workers' state, if the working class had taken political power in China, it would not have needed to carry out expropriations to abolish a capitalist class. It would have had this ready-made economic machinery at hand. And so our definition of a worker state and what the transition between a worker state and a capitalist state is really an economic phenomenon primarily. And so when we talk about capitalism, we're referring to a system which has private ownership of the means of production, a capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, and that's what we refer to as capitalism. And when we talk about imperialism, we're talking about a specific kind of imperialism. The concept of an empire has existed for a very long time. You can look at the Roman Empire controlling much of Europe. That's not really what we're talking about. What we're talking about is a phenomenon that developed within the capitalist world, really beginning in the late 1800s, when you had capitalist economies begin to develop around extensive monopolization. Instead of the sort of freewheeling world of competition of many different companies, all of which were relatively small, the sort of idealized view of capitalism, you had the development of these major monopolies that controlled entire industries, that controlled across multiple industries, that were a dominant economic and political feature of the leading capitalist states. And this is a phenomenon that Lenin describes in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, that these monopolies form the sort of economic and political basis of capitalist imperialism. And the sort of world features that you saw at that time in terms of annexations, formal colonies established across much of the world, imperialist wars, were the outgrowth of the competition of interests on the basis of these particular capitalist monopolies. And I should say that the term monopoly should not be interpreted quite so literally as to mean it only exists when there's a single company that controls everything in an industry. There can be a small handful of companies and it still constitutes a monopolistic situation as we describe it. And the sort of one of the big features of this capitalist imperialism, of monopoly capitalism, is a drive to export capital around the world. As these monopolies sort of soak up all of the good investment opportunities at home, they're driven to seek them abroad, where they can use their political and military control of different countries around the world to extract additional value through the super exploitation of workers around the world. And of course, the world we live in today is not the same as in 1914 or 1916. There's been a lot of changes in how monopoly capital functions, and there's one that I'd like to bring up because it's going to be particularly significant later on in my talk, and that's the distinction between a formal colony and a semi-colony. In 1914, most of the world was owned by formal colonies that were explicitly the possession of a particular power, that were under the direct legal control of that power, and through their flag, had their customs posts, had their military present. Today, that form of colony is a lot rarer. You might see a handful remaining around the world, places like Puerto Rico, which remains a formal US colony. But the dominant form of colonial rule today and of colonial extraction and imperialist extraction is the semi-colony. It's a state that is nominally independent, but which in practice is dependent politically, economically, militarily, in any number of ways on a large imperialist power or multiple imperialist powers. And I'll get into the sort of political meaning of this distinction later, but those are some of the terms I just wanted to set up before I got started. So looking at China, the transition from China being a worker state to being a capitalist state, you really turn the starting point towards the late 1970s and early 1980s. This is a China that's recovering from the policies of the Cultural Revolution. This is a China that has a pretty significant political backlash against a lot of those policies. It's a China where Mao Zedong is no longer in charge, and you see the beginning of the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. And you see this sort of perspective within the Chinese bureaucracy that things as they're going are not working, and China's remains very impoverished. It remains relatively weak on a global scale. In terms of the sort of rivalry and conflict between the Soviet Union and China, it is by a pretty wide margin the weaker power in that dispute. And it's also finds itself cut off from both a large portion of the socialist world, as it has this dispute with the Soviet Union, and also from much of the capitalist world, although it has started to build some bridges with Nixon's famous visit to China, and some of the political dealings it's made with the United States. out of the sort of this general milieu of the bureaucracy looking for a way out, really, from its current position, um, you see the first efforts to try and reform industry in China. And from around 1980 to around for a couple of years, like 1982, 1983, you see these efforts at reforming the state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, um, within China, to attempt to make them more productive. It's initially sort of keeps them within the context of economic planning and within the context of the existing economic and state apparatus, but with a number of reforms aimed toward increasing sort of the role of internal markets and toward modernizing their industry, and toward introducing new management techniques that will allow for, they believe, greater productivity. And this initial reform runs into a lot of resistance, both political resistance from workers in China who didn't really want much part of this reform, and also economic resistance, because the way that the political resistance was mostly dealt with was through offering higher wages as an incentive to get workers to join in on these programs. And then also there was a need to import a lot of new materials and machinery, which were quite expensive. And the sort of the economics of the project were not working out, and the political disputes were also making it very difficult to continue. It was too difficult at this point to sort of carry on a reform project directly through the industrial